Thank you, Professor Hidemi, for my introduction. Greetings to all. Today with my paper, with the introduction as it is, contribution of philosophy in Syriac literature, and also the meta-philosophical analysis. Introduction, I have added some points of the origin and the date of Syriac originations. There are some little bit points are there. So the language is Syriac. So Lation of Suryoyo is also known as Syriac Aramaic or classical Syriac is a dialect of Middle Aramaic. Syriac is a Middle Aramaic language and such a language of the Northwest Semitic language of the Afro-Asiatic. It is written in the Syriac alphabet, a derivation of the Aramaic alphabet. Though classical Syriac became a major literary language throughout the Middle Eastern from the 4th to the 8th centuries AD, it was there in Edessa in the 1st centuries AD. So it is preserved in a large body of Syriac literature. Syriac was once spoken across much of the Near East as well as Anatolia and Eastern Arabia. With the introduction, I have added one more point, the relation with Aramaic with Syriac language. The old Aramaic language was adopted by the New Assyrian Empire in the 10th to 7th BC time period, where the Assyrians conquered the various Syro-Hittite states into west. The Achaemenid Empire, which rose after the fall of the Assyrian Empire, also retained Old Aramaic as its official language, and Old Aramaic remained the lingua franca of the region. During the course of the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, the inhabitants of the region began to embrace Christianity. Along with the Latin and Greek, Syriac became one of the 3 most important Christian languages in the early centuries of the Common Era. From the 1st century AD, Syriac became the vehicle of Syriac Christianity and culture and the liturgical language of Syrian churches. There are some more points about the correlation between Aramaic and Syriac. Here the points is describe how the relation with the Syriac and Aramaic. Majority of the people, they believe that there is no relation of philosophy, there is no relation with the philosophical thoughts in Syriac language, but it is, we have to find, we should confirm that we have the relation, the Syriac language should have the relation with the philosophy because the Aramaic language is closely related to the philosophical literature. So the Aramaic contributions to Jewish literature belong to both Eastern and the Western branches of the language. West Aramaic is the Aramaic portions of the Bible, the Palestinian Targumim, the Aramaic portions of the Palestinian Talmud, and the Palestinian Midrashim. In Palestinian Aramaic, the dialect of Galilee was different from that of Judah. And as a result of the religious separation of the Jews and the Samaritans, a special Samaritan dialect was evolved, but its literature cannot be considered Jewish. The dialect of Edessa, which owing to the Bible version made in it, became the literary language of the Christian Arameans, bearing preeminently the title of Syriac, was certainly also employed in ancient times by Jewish people and Jewish culture. This Syriac translation of the Bible, the so-called Shita, was made partly by Jews and was intended for the use of Jewish people. And one book from it has been adopted broadly into Targumic literature as the Targum upon Proverbs. If all the Aramaic documents in the world were placed in one room, and 90% of them would be written in the Aramaic dialect of Edessa, a city in southeast of Turkey, which is totally known as Urfa. This Aramaic dialect is called Syriac for half a millennium. From the 4th century to the 9th, Syriac was literary lingua franca of much of the population of the Middle East. Syriac writers have left as a broad and rich literature for students of Christian history. Only Greek and Latin are more important, and in fact, a number of important Greek works are now preserved only in Syriac is very important. So the continuation of Syriac literature from the Aramaic literature is here. According to the Syriac literature, as a common view, This literature was brought by the Christian fathers as well as the theological writers of Syrian church. Agreeing with this statement, it is hard for the literature for Syriac because the language is there with its existence and still continuing. A good number of Syriac literature was made up by the Syrian Christian fathers or authors is acceptable. So the scholarly researches and studies were not happened until the modern times, not in genuinely. The development of Syriac literature may be divided in terms of its general characteristics and literary merit in three stages. The first period extending from the pre-Christian era to the 8th century AD is represented both by few surviving pagan works and by the far more extensive Christian literature. The latter half of this period may be regarded as the golden age of Syriac literature. The production of native religious literature by the luminaries of the Syrian church was carried one side by side with translation of Greek philosophy into Syriac. Western scholars have generally assumed that Syriac literature first came into existence with the beginning of the great Christian movements of the Syrian church about the start of the century. This is rather a dangerous assumption. However, in view not only of the highly polished state of development which the Syriac language had attained at that time, but also of the non-Christian literature which has come down to us from the same period. Indeed, we shall surely adduce evidence that the Syriac language served as the vehicle for literature quite some time before the birth of Christ. Rubens Dual acknowledged that Mesopotamia as the birthplace of Syrian literature, but he denies that the nation possessed any genuine national literature of its own. If there had been a national culture in Mesopotamia, he argues that either it would have been preserved by tradition or it would have left some trace in the Christian era. The alternative possibility that Syriac literature was an indigenous product is dismissed with the assertion that it was not the genius creation of a nation which developed progressively or which possessed continuous tradition. So we are going to the main important point that the importance of philosophy besides the Syriac literature writings. There are so many literature, we know there are so many literature from the Syriac fathers, theological sermons are there, homilies are there, poems are there, everything is there. But it is a close encounter to find out whether there is philosophical background or philosophical notions behind all the Syriac literature. As we know, philosophy is a scientific philosophy is from the Greek world, the ancient land of Asia Minor. From the Greek fountain, nations drew their knowledge and learned men set out in quest of Greek principle until their ages. Philosophy is the fundamental reasoning to acquire true knowledge, that is the wisdom. It is the medium which coheres with the literature where I look for true knowledge in accordance with the reasonable writing. Philosophy and literature are related to kinds of branches like philosophy of literature, literature of philosophy, and also philosophy in literature, and so on. It means philosophy has its own significance in literature always. Socrates and Plato were concerned in the company of philosophy and literature. Philosophy of literature is the result of logical thinking and the way of aesthetic reasoning. The ancient Greek philosophy has the identity all of the universe, but the others having kinds of relativistic philosophy. Similarly, the culture, the nations of Syrians, they have no any specific philosophy like Romans and Copts. It is still in the process of development, and as philosophy to the Syrians, who generally speaking were men of religious nature, was a means, not an end, but the chief scholars did not place great emphasis on it. There are several writings of philosophy in Syriac literature. Majority works of Syriac literature in philosophy, they were translating from the Greek philosophy, and also the Syriac was the bridge between the Greek philosophy and the Islamic philosophy. So Marbar's Raphaeon is the initial of the Syriac philosophy in the early period of AD. His writing to his son shows the wisdom practice is the principles of Stoic philosophy. As a part of Christian Syriac literature, Laws of the Countries of Bardaisan was a philosophical work. Who was an Aramean philosopher, Sergius of Rasain was philosopher and man of profound knowledge. He was also an efficient writer who had great command of Syriac language. He studied sciences at Alexandria and both Greek and Syriac sciences. His noble writings testify that he studied the philosophical and medical sciences extensively. In the first years of 7th century, there was teaching on philosophy by Bishop Severus Sebukth. He tried to explore the commentaries on Aristotle's philosophical work to commend the scriptural explanation. Creation, the first cause, etc., were discussed by Jacob of Edessa, was an elaborative function of Syrian literature on philosophy, and he was the disciple of Severus. Athanasius of Second of Ballard, Catholicus of Tagrith Ahudame were also had done studies on Greek philosophy. Bishop George the Arabs could make an exposition on the work of Jacob of Edessa. Moses Bar Kifa had his own philosophical work in Syriac literature. At the same period of 10th century, an unknown author who did about the mystic philosophy entitled with Kosa Kosaru. Other philosophical writers were Habib Abu Raita Tagrith, Nonos of Nisibin, he is archdeacon at the 9th century, and Bosses Barkifa Metropolitan Beth Rahman. There are so many Syriac scholars were dealing with Greek philosophical writings. They were translating from Greek to Syriac, and they were teaching their monasteries to give more explanations on Greek philosophical notions. They were well versed in both Syriac and Arabic, and some had mastered in Greek. Their works and translation, however, did not fall within the scope of this work. The scholars who concerned themselves with philosophy in the fourth and last year of Dionysius of Barslibi, who was the Metropolitan of Amirs, who wrote a commentary in the 12th century on the Isagoge of Porphyry, commentaries on the categories, the allegorical interpretation of the Holy Scriptures, and the analytical Aristotelic philosophy. The scholars were Gabriel of Edessa, he is from the 13th century, who wrote many medical and philosophical works. Jacob of Bar Shako, he is more Shabo, it is more correctively. Of Bertulli, who wrote compendium work on logic and definition of philosophy, and also natural, mathematical, and theological literature for establishing them in Christian schools. We know the arithmetic and the logic, everything is related to the logical philosophy. The person who concluded the Aristotelic philosophy works among the Syrians was Bar Hebreus, who studied them as adopted from the Greek and added to them what he fancied from the writings of Arab philosophers, Ibn Sina in particular. He wrote a valuable large encyclopedia entitled with Hewath Hekamzo, The Cream of Wisdom, in 3 volumes comprising the whole Aristotelian discipline, which he abridged in his work. Also, he wrote 2 small works entitled The Speech of Wisdom and The Pupils of the Eyes, 2 treatises on the irrational soul and philosophical poetry. In these works, he attained to the utmost height and eminent end. He was also determined to write a larger work on philosophy in which he would explain its obscurities and reveal its secrets, relying on his deduction and personal opinion, but his death prevented the realization of his dream. By Theodosius Romanus, Pater of Antioch from the 9th century, we have a treatise comprising 112 Pythagorean maxims, to which he added a few commentaries in Syriac and Arabic. Here we are discussing about philosophy in Syriac literature and also the metaphysical realm. Philosophy in Semitic way is hard to find while comparing with Greek notion, as well as the Aramaic or Syriac literature is also underestimated with those things. The conclusion is settled to philosophy. It is not a philosophy of science, rather a kind of reasoning, a kind of logic, the metaphilosophy. While seeking all literature, it is found that philosophy takes place for its better progress. There are clear indications that philosophical way of writing or the philosophical works in this literature. Here, I'm not following nor researching the philosophical works, hence, a healthier subsequent of meta-philosophy from the Syriac literature. The term meta-philosophy is very known for us. Meta-philosophy is understood as it is nature of philosophy or the philosophy of the philosophy. It is a self-reflective inquiry into the nature, aims, and methods of the activity that makes these kinds of inquiries by asking what is philosophy itself, or what sorts of questions it should ask, how it might pose and answer them, and what it can achieve in doing so. The early periods of Aramaic, the scriptural writings were in the philosophical realm, very same to the other literal writings. Most probably, the continuation of pagan literature from the south of Edessa was the Aramaic literature. The literature allied to the philosophical means, principally ethics and wisdom advices. The legend of Ahikar was written between the 6th and 5th century of BC. Does not eliminate the possibility that it is much earlier date. The importance of the legend, however, is that it may be considered the oldest literary monument of the Aramaic language. This Aramaic, which is the same as that of the books of Ezra and Nehemiah of the Old Testament, must not be very different from the SEERI of Edessa, except perhaps in certain terms and idiomatic expressions. Some Eastern Syrian writers are of the opinion that the language of Ahikar represented in these Aramaic papyri is the same as the language used by Bardesan, Mara Bar Seraphion, Ephrahat, and Saint Ephraim. And the piece of Syriac literature, interesting because of its antiquity, is the surviving poem of the Aramean Wafa, who lived well before the Christianity. This poet was first mentioned by Antonius Rhetor in the 10th chapter of the 5th treatise of his book, The Knowledge of Rhetoric. The rhetoric work of Wafa is the rational one, is very close to Aramaic literature and close to the Semitic philosophy. So the last conclusion, we are going to the point, why meta-philosophy for Syriac literature? We had seen there are works from the Greek to Syriac. There are Syrian fathers who did from Greek to Islamic philosophy. Beyond that, beyond those things, there are questions arising against the Syriac philosophy. Majority of the Syrian scholars, the theologians, they never accept that there is Syriac philosophy is existing still. The last points were discussing about every literature has philosophy. Every philosophy has literature and vice versa. The both things should be in mind because the literature is from the logical reasoning, the literature from the clear and very evident philosophical thoughts. So why meta-philosophy? We know meta-philosophy is the philosophy of the philosophy. So the meta-philosophical convention of philosophy is implemented in the Syriac literature. However, the arguments like Syriac literature has no specific philosophy are mandated to be inadequate because every literature has its own reasonable way to enhance its identity by accepting other literal culture. Through the Aramaic literature or the scripture or biblical means, indistinguishable stand is there to be always legitimate. The responsibility of meta-philosophy is to find the philosophy behind all the literal writings of Syrian fathers before the Syrian or the Aramaic literature, everything, even though it is entitled as theology or any other sciences. There are certain major themes in theological and in the other Syriac writings to be brought, being as philosophical terms, works of Syrian fathers like Ephrahat and Ephraim. There are so many theological themes are there, and those theological themes and terminology can be interpreted by the background of philosophical terminologies. So these theological themes can be elaborated with the metaphilosophical philosophy and also metaphysics of the philosophy. The philosophy from all the results, that means all the writings, should be affianced to the meta-philosophy so that it may extend to the pure philosophical sphere in the great Syriac literature. Thank you.